My name is Todd Beck, and I'm a web seminar producer for ACAMS. Welcome to the ACAMS web seminar, The Rise of Organized Financial Crime, the New Mafia. Today's event is sponsored by Verifone, and we're very pleased today to have one of the co-founders of Verifone, Brendan Brothers, on our panel. Brendan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Todd. As introduced, my name is Brendan Brothers. I'm a co-founder of Verifone, and I'm very happy to be joined by Chris Swecker today as well. Verifone, as a co-founder of the company, we started the business in about 2003, and my background is actually in artificial intelligence, analytics, and computer engineering, probably about as far away from financial crime as you can imagine, but that's the foundation of our business. I've become a subject matter expert in the anti-financial crime world, and combining together that technical expertise has allowed me to be a frequent speaker at industry conferences. I'm a principal presenter in Verifone's Thought Leadership series, and I've presented the application to hundreds of institutions. We have 1,000 financial institutions now which are using the application. Todd, if you want to hand the ball over to me, I'll start going through the slides here. Perfect. Thanks very much. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Chris Swecker, and Chris is a retired assistant director of the FBI with 24 years experience as a member of the FBI. As head of the criminal division, he led all investigations, including those with regards to public corruption, money laundering, organized crime, drug trafficking, and financial crime. And as part of that, I think he's going to bring a wealth of real-world expertise and understanding to the problem we're going to talk about today. He served as an on-team commander in Iraq in 2003, led national task forces on corporate fraud, violent gangs, financial crimes, and so on, and has spent time in industry as well as the Global Security Director at B of A from 2006 to 2009. So in today's presentation, I'll take the first portion of the presentation and spend 20 or 30 minutes talking about the rise of organized financial crime, and then Chris will close us out at the end. And as I said, we're very happy that he's here with us today. Today's conversation is really about the new mafia and the rise of criminal enterprise. Enterprise is an extremely important word in this because you're going to see as we go through today's presentation that it's not the one-off mom-and-pop type instance that we see now. It's really organized financial crime enterprises which are attacking our financial institutions, stealing money from our businesses and our consumers, and really the thing that's, I guess, most prevalent in the world right now. If you think about individuals and businesses depending more and more heavily on data and systems in the virtual world, it really opens your eyes to the scope of the problem. For example, if you think about the statistics that we sometimes see, there's over 2 billion internet users worldwide, and most of those are using email every day. 144 billion emails are sent per day, and almost 70% of those are spam. Even think about the emails you get in your own inbox. Would you be able to say that 70% of them are spam? Think about the number of websites that exist in the world right now, over 600 million websites, and that's an increase of 51 million just since last year. The opportunity for a fraudster and for these organized crime entities to attack through email, to attack through malicious websites and so on, has never been higher than it is today. And every new technology really opens the door to new criminal approaches. Cyberspace is really no different from that. If you think about cyberspace and the growing opportunity there for organized crime, it's all because really in the good old days, we'll say, the internet was unfortunately never conceived with security in mind. When the internet was invented, it was an information sharing tool for universities and academics. We probably never were able to envision the type of e-commerce and things that exist there today. And the amount of crime that comes along with that is certainly very significant. Thinking about the victims of cybercrime, even just last year in 2012, there were 500 million victims of cybercrime. That's 1.5 million victims per day, 18 per second. And almost all of those data breaches can be attributed to organized crime. So we're talking about a very significant problem and a large problem. That cyberspace has proven to be that gold mine for criminals. They've moved more deeply into the domain, they've seen opportunities to profit, and that just continues to increase day in, day out. And really, if you think about it, the day that money became the focus of malware, that's the day the internet changed. When malware was a nuisance, when it was an inconvenience, that's one thing. But now malware is directly targeted at stealing money, committing that financial crime. And it's not like the mafia. It actually is a mafia running these operations. And that's the real thing that we want to talk about in today's presentation. we're going to talk about organized criminal groups. And an organized criminal group, really, what we define here is it's a structured group, an organized group, typically of 3 or more persons that exists for a certain period of time. So it's not a one-and-done type scenario. It acts in concert, and it commits serious crimes to either directly or indirectly obtain financial or other material benefit. And this is very different than the types of online crime that we might have seen even as near as 10 years ago, for example. You know, just a few years ago, most hackers either acted out of curiosity or really just the glory of spreading a virus they had written. You know, there's a continuum of fraudsters, and, you know, we'll say back in the good old days when it was just script kiddies and, you know, individuals who were able to instantiate this kind of fraud, it was more for play or for nuisance. But now we've progressed through to see organized cyber criminals where they're specialized, they're creating markets, they're entrepreneurial. And because of the internet, there's actually been a radical distribution of labor and a radically fast ability to recruit skills. Now we're talking about organized enterprise. We're talking about potential state-sponsored terrorists and attacks. It's much more sophisticated now than it's ever been before. You know, some economies in the former Soviet Union, Central, Eastern European, these are noted as crime hotspots, cybercrime hotspots. Europol put out a report earlier this year, their Serious and Organized Crime Threat Assessment, and they estimated that 3,600 organized crime groups are active right now in the EU. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons why this has become quite so pervasive. Certainly, it's extremely profitable. It's very easy for these entities to steal money, to be able to get illegitimate gain. There's very low infrastructure costs, and there's very readily available attack tools. Oftentimes, they hide under a cloak of anonymity, you know, sometimes protected by the governments across the globe. As it becomes that more profitable industry, as any industry does, it attracts an increasing number of individuals, and it provides the separation between the physical and virtual world. It's off the shelf, and the groups can really conduct their operations even without physically contacting each other. The virtual world allows us to do that. And these organized criminal groups are increasingly operating on that network-style basis. You know, it's not a single group, it's sometimes groups in collusion with each other. 70% of these organizations are comprised of members of multiple nationalities. More than 30% are polycrime. And probably most frighteningly of all, they're all very entrepreneurial in their approach and their business management. I'm going to touch on that entrepreneurial nature in just a few minutes when we talk about the model that we've seen from I guess, a criminal organization perspective. Unfortunately, we've also seen a rise in cybercrime because of the recession. You know, as the economy goes downwards, crime of all types goes upwards, whether it's identity theft in a branch in a bank or cybercrime. You know, high rates of unemployment in the U.S. and around the world have really made it easy for criminal organizations to recruit these young masterminds. And as a very practical story of that, there was an article written in Wired a couple years back, and they talked about a town in Romania. I encourage you, even if you just Google Wired and Hackerville, you'll find this article, and it's really quite something when you read it. This remote town in Romania, I won't, presume to pronounce the name of the town today, but law enforcement really around the world nicknamed it Hackerville because internet scammers and their quote-unquote coworkers turned it into a hub of international organized crime. It's a center of e-commerce scams and of the malware attacks that hit businesses each and every day. And it's really the Silicon Valley of online thievery. One of the things that I took away from the article when I read it is just the description that you're driving into this remote town and all of a sudden you see the lights of these luxury car dealerships. In the middle of Romania, Mercedes dealerships, BMW dealerships, and so on, because the amount of money coming into this location, the bad guys want to have fancy cars, and they're able to do that. Back in July, local law enforcement, the FBI, actually apprehended 23 hackers who were imprisoned for stealing $20 million in this town. And you would think that would be significant, but it's the whack-a-mole problem at the end of the day. You get one group and two groups pop up. And really it can be summarized in this quote from George, who's a citizen of Hackerville. What else can you do? There's no work. The government speaks only of crisis and reduction of salaries. This guy's 24 and during university done nothing but sacrifice. He sees these guys driving fancy cars and doing this, and really just sitting at a computer. Why wouldn't he try to do this kind of thing? So it's organized, it's sophisticated, and it's attacking institutions day in and day out. And it's run like a business. The classic business model, which any of us would be taught in business school, that's been adopted by criminal enterprise. So all the kinds of things that drive a business, profit, market, money, success, all these kinds of things that drive legitimate enterprise, drive criminal enterprise in the exact same way. And just as an example of that, think about a criminal enterprise model. This is from a Fortinet report in 2013. They wrote a cybercrime report, and the model that they describe is really quite applicable to how criminal enterprises typically work. Every enterprise starts off with a corporate mission, whether it's criminal or not. And the corporate mission for a lot of these groups is really around profitability, sometimes retribution, when we think about it from a terrorist financing perspective. Organized crime, it's a multi-billion-dollar business, and it's only growing in scale. And it looks, acts, smells like any other enterprise within the world. If you think about the organizational structure, you could almost call it crime as a service. There's an executive suite, there's recruiters, there's infantry, help wanted, money mules. Different roles, different specialists within these types of organizations. The executive, as in any business, sets up the original business model, sets up the infrastructure, and once the operation gets off the ground, moves into business development. They make decisions, they oversee the operations, they ensure that everything runs smoothly, and then hand off the dirty work to others. They're typically not involved with actually launching the attacks themselves. Now, take this slide and apply it to any company in the world, IBM, Dell, Facebook. Executives, this is what they do. They set up the organization, they make decisions and oversee, but they don't typically do the day-to-day. Exactly the same in the criminal enterprise. Middle management recruiters bring people in. These sometimes are larger organizations that have affiliates who recruit and manage the infantry, and they actually infect the machines for them. Sometimes they set up these recruitment programs, and really it's funded by the executive at the end of the day. Their whole objective is to get infantry, get the doers. And the infantry, it's the bottom of the chain of command. These are the ground level forces. These are the folks that are out there initiating infections on user machines. They're the prolific cyber criminals that, see this number? $5 million per year. It's staggering what they can do by controlling a large botnet of malware-infected PCs. I've got some stats coming up on distributed denial of service attacks that might scare some of the bankers on the phone. But in many ways, they infect computers, whether it's through email links or SEO attacks, poison PDFs. That seems to be the flavor of the month in my email account the past couple of weeks. And really leverage social networking links as well, whether it's websites, Flash, QuickTime, and so on. These are the doers. These are the folks that are executing the attacks. And then you have the people who help move money, the money mules. Either knowingly or unknowingly, they're employed to launder the gains. Sometimes they're recruited via ads. You'll often see the accounts receivable positions, sometimes offered on Craigslist or some of these other career sites. And they're responsible for moving money from one country to another. We all know about money mules, sometimes shuffling money through wire transfer services, trying their best to be anonymous, whether it's proxied or an anonymous wire transfer, trying to avoid detection, trying to get around AML monitoring systems, for example, and sometimes using several mules to really hide the source of their funds. A critical component and a critical role within a criminal organization, because these are the ones that get the money from point A to point B, and oftentimes take the legal responsibility of moving that money. A lot of times as well, we see different types of technology like help-wanted web portals. You may be surprised to learn that there are websites that are used to recruit these infantry, these affiliate programs. Oftentimes, many of them originate in Russia. Sometimes they're closed communities that are accessible by invite only. Sometimes they're open to the public with fairly transparent disclaimers on them. We do not allow spam or other illicit methods for machine infection. But we know what they are. We know that they're sites that their sole purpose is to be able to recruit people to perpetrate these kinds of attacks. They're in place oftentimes to put the legal responsibility on the doers, keep the responsibility away from the executives. and provide the infantry with all the necessary information to begin that infection campaign. These portals which give them their malware, give them support, payment rates, and so on. It all follows the simple fundamental laws of economics that we learned when we went through school. The types of deliverables, the types of services that are being offered, whether it's consulting or advertising, a large selection of product, spam, those kinds of things. And as in the normal economy, the richer the product feature, the more complex the service, the more it demands a higher price. Just to give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, when Denise Hutchings put together this presentation with us, she's on our marketing team here as well, she showed me this screen and I was like, well, yeah, that just looks like a very normal Wall Street Journal webpage, a webpage that any of us would go to today. Some of the types of attack vectors that these folks use, whether it's click hijacking or changing advertisements on web pages or using different kinds of Trojans, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to drive you to a website like here on the right-hand side. Looks like the Wall Street Journal, pretty much exactly the same. But there's an ad in there which is different. And they want you to click on that. They want you to capture that information. They want you to fill out a form. They want to get malware installed on your computer. So they're actually hijacking these websites. You go in and you think you're doing a normal Google search to get to the Wall Street Journal, and all of a sudden you pop up on this page where this malware can get you. Think about Amazon. How many of us use this web page every day? Again, similar thing, hijack ads over here on the right-hand side. ESPN. We're into college basketball, hockey playoff season. People are going to these websites all the time. And again, hijacking the ads, making things look legitimate, but actually an opportunity to get malware installed on your computer to be able to hijack your identities. Very simple examples. These are pulled from a case from the Southern District of New York. If you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. They showed examples of how this Russian gang had used these pages to be able to compromise people's computers, to install malware, to be able to hijack accounts, all very simply and very easily. I mentioned distributed denial of service attacks. There was a recent one with Bank of the West. Ask your IT teams when you get off the phone today, how much it actually costs to prevent, manage, mitigate, respond to these kinds of things. I bet you not nearly as much as it costs to actually perpetrate them. As an example, we've seen instances where one criminal enterprise will actually perform a denial of service attack in parallel to another group compromising accounts. Group 1 has gone in and they've compromised 100 accounts. They want to go in and steal all the money they can. Group 2 fires off the denial of service attack so the legitimate customers can't hit the websites, and it costs nothing. $10 an hour, $1,200 a month. These are from the United Nations Inter-Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute. The numbers are really quite staggering. And if you think about it from a technology perspective, you think, well, we should just be able to shut these down. We should be able to find these domains. We should be able to stop them. Well, closing old sites, opening up new ones, it's that old whack-a-mole game again. For every malicious domain that's taken down, 2 more often pop up in its place. Well, why don't we go after the hosting providers? They're critical to the success of the criminals. They're hosting things, the exploit code, the malware, all of it has to exist somewhere. But oftentimes they're providing this storage for these compromised systems, typically offshore, sometimes in political safe havens that turn a blind eye to this kind of thing. But there's even been instances where U.S. hosting providers have provided links to malware. Here the example of a California-based host before it was taken offline. Of all, though, the biggest reason that this is so exciting to criminals is the anonymity. By having layered communication infrastructure, by having infected machines which don't actually speak directly to the operators of the criminal enterprise, going through intermediate machines, using compromised machines, using technology such as VPN. Their goal really at the end of the day is to complicate the tracing efforts, prevent people from catching them. And, a main server might exist for botnets. It receives commands through other intermediate services. They're putting layer in front of layer in front of layer to try and prevent that detection. Sometimes they call that main server the mothership. So you have the people involved, you have the technology involved, and at the end of the day, it's all about money, isn't it? So why not manage our money as a criminal enterprise? Sometimes the executives, keep track of these in terms of key metrics. Think about any business that you run. At Verifone, we keep track of metrics. We know how many customers we have. We know how many support issues we have. We know how much money we're making. The criminal enterprise does the exact same thing. They keep track of how many infected machines they have, how many bank accounts they have, how much money has been transferred, and so on. They use commercial business process management tools. They use financial systems, databases, web portals. It's absolutely staggering that they run these as legitimate enterprises, but they're not really legitimate at its core. And they manage everything from software development to accounts payable. From a research perspective, they actually do R&D. Sometimes these attack vectors that they use, these types of malware and so on, they're not trivial, so they need to be developed. They need to be tested. These extensive R&D groups can actually create whatever syndicates need to attack and infect systems. They can provide custom-ordered code. They can provide botnets, antivirus, and so on. And just the same as it would be in a normal enterprise, the code is put through a QA process to ensure that it functions and potentially evades security detection. The same as if you were building software within your own financial institution, the same kinds of controls that you would put in place. And then, best of all, from a business development perspective, they connect with other organizations and distributors to grow their operation. Some enterprises have specialized in particular areas like DDoS attacks, like malware development, like script hijacking. Well, mergers and acquisitions actually occur all the time within these enterprises due to competition. Think about the example of Zeus and SpyEye, two separate groups that actually end up becoming the same spyware. It's a perfect example of the types of activity that occurs within this type of realm. So the sophistication that comes along with an organized criminal group, it's very similar to organizations within the real world. And because of that, it's really quite staggering. You have to think about it from a financial institution perspective of how do I actually protect my institution against cyber fraud? And one of the best models and kind of best material we've seen for this comes out of Gartner. Aviva Latan is one of their key analysts that we speak with from time to time with regards to cybercrime, online fraud, and so on. And one of her latest papers, she talks about how she suspects in 2013 organized gangs will perpetrate at least half of the cybercrimes against financial services, as these offshore gangs thrive and foreign governments look the other way. And their recommendation from Gartner is really to deploy layered fraud prevention, in particular systems that provide user or account behavioral profiling and entity link analysis that can be useful in these cases. One of her most recent papers talks about how a layered security system affords the best protection since no single layer is sufficient to stop determined bad actors from penetrating, enterprise systems. In some of the previous webinars that I've done for ACAMS, we've talked about, Russian nesting dolls and using the example of your home security with fences and guard dogs and alarm systems and so on. Everything always comes back to this layered security model because it is truly the only way I think that you can properly protect a financial institution from this kind of attack. And in the Gartner model, there's 5 layers of protection. And I'll go through each of these right now just to provide you some context of this. The first layer that Gartner talks about is endpoint-centric prevention. And certainly this is directly flowing out of some of the guidance from the FFIEC guidance that came out at the beginning of 2012. But endpoint-centric in the terms of trying to implement things like secure browsing, out-of-band authentication, transaction verification, and so on. These are all right out at the device level, trying to be that first layer of defense, device identification, and so on. If we think a little bit deeper, we want to be able to model user behavior and look at it from a navigation-centric perspective. This can often be effective in trying to identify fraud as well, where you're analyzing the exhibited behavior of a user, analyzing that session behavior, and comparing it to what's expected. Are they navigating to the same pages? Are they trying to instantiate the same actions? Are they coming in from the same IP addresses, same date and times, and so on? Those can be useful pieces of evidence or behavior to try and identify whether or not a potential attack is occurring. But the Gartner model also differentiates between channel monitoring as well. And this is, I think, where you start to see the meat of detection, because when you look at user and account-centric modeling for a specific channel, now really what we're talking about is monitoring and analyzing user and account behavior within a specific channel, identifying anomalous behavior. So are there unusual activity from an ACH perspective, from a wire perspective, and looking at those channels independently to try and see, based upon past behavior, what do we think about this current activity. Looking at that specific single channel, it's another effective way, it's a deeper effective way to be able to identify potential suspicious activity. But I think as you start to look across multiple channels and products, again, you're introducing another layer, a deeper layer of defense, whether it's combining those different types of online banking activity together, but also thinking about activity that's happening through the branch or the call center. Is there evidence of new account fraud within the branch network, and then we're also seeing unusual activity through the online channel? Is there some evidence of unusual card activity and branch activity on online channel? As you start to open up your view and look across that fraud and anti-money laundering landscape, you can start to analyze and correlate alerts across channels and get a deeper understanding of unusual behavior. And then the fifth layer within the Gartner model is pattern-based intelligence, entity link analysis. And this is really now starting to think about consortiums, cross-institutional analysis, and so on, and really enabling analysis of relationships, both internal and external entities and their attributes. So whether it's users, accounts, machines, trying to look at it from a pattern-based intelligence perspective. At Verifin, we think the most effective way to protect the financial institution really is from the inside out. Looking at the channels, trying to not only do single channel or specific channel analysis, but look across channels to get a proper view of everything that's going on within that customer behavior, and then expanding it out and adding in additional layers and additional layers. That will truly give you the best ability to pick up on suspicious activity. Before I wrap up and I hand it over to Chris for the second portion of our presentation, I did want to share with you one interesting tidbit that we picked up from the director of FinCEN a couple of weeks ago. She actually spoke at a SciFin conference, I think it was only a couple of weeks back now, and when Jennifer Shafsky-Calvary spoke at this, she talked about how BSA reports can play a significant role in cybercrime investigation. She was speaking about some of the new technology and the new analytics and new enhancements that FinCEN has in their IT modernization project, and she shared an example of how very practically institutions can affect cybercrime investigations. She spoke of an instance where they identified a scheme involving computer intrusion techniques and malware. They actually identified unauthorized transfers of funds from small business accounts to temporary accounts that were created specifically for that purpose. And once the fraud was perpetrated, the accounts were closed or abandoned, and more than 50 transfers were attempted over the 4-month period. The actual loss, the theft, was almost $1 million in 24 transfers. And the suspects used multiple banks, used multiple accounts, and through the filings that these institutions made to FinCEN, FinCEN was able to use their analytics to try to put together the bigger picture of this. They actually noted that financial institutions had filed more than 40 SARs and 20 CTRs detailing illicit activity in the movement of funds. And because of that, FinCEN was able to identify a network of individuals with connections to Russia and Eastern Europe. So I hope that while I certainly present the sophistication of these groups and hopefully not scare people on the phone, there is light here. There is an ability for us to try and detect this by using multiple layers to prevent it, but then also by identifying activity and reporting that into FinCEN, that information can be extremely valuable and it can find these cyber criminals. One of the things when I speak to compliance officers, I always hear the fear that their reports are going into the black hole. I think FinCEN is starting to do a much better job now of telling institutions, you know what, it's not a black hole. We're using this information and we're finding these things because of the information that's being reported. But it starts with the institution yourself, trying to be able to identify this activity, report it to FinCEN, clear and concise narratives, identification of transactions. We can catch these activities, and we can try to start preventing these types of cybercrime. As Todd mentioned off the top, we're likely going to be right to the hour with this presentation, but I certainly appreciate feedback, comments, and questions. My email address is here, brendan.brothers@verifin.com. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today about this problem. It's something that I fear to say is exciting, but it's something I think that we should all keep our eyes open for, because this rise is certainly coming. We're in the midst of it right now, and it's something that I think we need to be keenly and importantly aware of. I'm going to hand it over to my friend Chris Swecker now, and he's going to continue our discussion of this rise of Eurasian financial crime enterprise. A lot of the content that Chris is going to share with us today is based upon a white paper that we'll provide to you after today's presentation, and really details the progression of this rise in financial crime, and it's an excellent read, and I certainly encourage you all to read that. So, Chris, I'll hand the ball over to you, and you should be able to continue on in our presentation.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. That was great. I understand that there may be as many as 3,000 people online here. It's the marvel of technology that I don't see you, because I would be very nervous talking in front of 3,000 people in person. So I'm just staring at a computer screen and not nervous at all. My job here is to really play color commentary to Brendan's play-by-play. This is not a new concept, of course. I mean, you're a very sophisticated audience, AML and fraud professionals. I understand there are many of you are also some of my former colleagues in federal law enforcement, state and local law enforcement. So you sort of know the score here. It's going to. My hope is that I can tell you some things that you don't already know. You know, it's important to understand what we're dealing with and when we're who our adversary is. And again, let me say at the outset here, I may not get through all my slides because of the time crunch, but I tend to provide more information in the slides than I can possibly cover. So I'm not going to read the slides to you, and I'm going to move through fairly quickly. But there is a lot of information in here, especially towards the end, that I hope to cover but may not get to. This financial crimes and money laundering, in my opinion, are almost inseparable. You will very seldom see a financial crime indictment without a money laundering count included as well. And conversely, you'll hardly ever see a money laundering indictment by itself. It's as Charles Intriago says, it's the atomic bomb charge. It is something that is such a staple in prosecution these days that you hardly ever see. And most criminal indictments will, if they can, include a money laundering indictment. And it is a separate crime for each transaction. It is a powerful, powerful weapon that those in federal and state and local law enforcement use. So when Brendan says SARs are important, they really are. I think FinCEN's capabilities are increasing. And if you ask me if I were still working the streets as an FBI agent, if you told me I could have one database to work with, pick it, I would say give me the SAR database. It's great information, and as the analytical firepower increases, we're going to be able to, and you'll see FinCEN and you are making links that you wouldn't have made 5-10 years ago. Why is this important? Why is it important to know who's out there and who's inflicting losses on your organizations and your customers? Well, this is an often quoted, probably one of the most quoted passages in the world when you talk about knowing your enemy. That's the part that you usually hear when Sun Tzu is quoted, know your enemy. But you also have to know yourself, and that means know your own capabilities and match your capabilities with your adversary. And that's critically important in the field that you're in anti-fraud, anti-money laundering. I would suggest to you, and part of my theme today is that perhaps we're addressing yesterday's enemy in adversary and the way we go about our anti-fraud and money laundering strategies. And I'm not suggesting that you're spending your days looking for John Gotti, looking for traditional organized crime, trying to detect that type of activity. But what I am saying is I think many of our processes and many of our strategies are geared towards bricks and mortar crime. They're very familiar processes, and I'll talk a little bit about detection without context. You really need to have detection and alerts that have some context around them. If we're simply taking the next alert, next case out of the queue, we're really not. It's not going to be productive or efficient. So I'm really trying to illustrate here that this is the old traditional crime model that I think we were originally set up to address. Again, drug trafficking organizations, everybody knows that the Mexican drug cartels are probably the most dominant drug cartels. No longer are the Colombians at the top of that pyramid. But the one thing that is still out there is they are generating huge amounts of cash. And a lot of that cash is pouring across the border physically on that return cycle back to Mexico and points south. But this is bricks and mortar crime. and this is something that I think the the money laundering laws were originally set up to address, and our processes were originally set up to address. Primarily the more organized, more traditional, more hierarchical criminal organizations. And as Brendan pointed out earlier, what we're really talking about now are criminal enterprises that are not bricks and mortar. In fact, up until probably the mid-2000s, the FBI's organized crime section was really set up. It was a legacy section set up to address traditional organized crime. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that they actually renamed the section to be a criminal enterprise section in recognition that these are less traditional, less hierarchical, more networked as opposed to hierarchical. So I want to sort of track through how we got to where we are today in terms of what I think is the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in history. And we're talking about something that had its genesis back in 1989, before the wall came down. The Russian mob, the intelligence services in the Soviet states were sort of in a symbiotic relationship. The KGB, the government, had to have the black market operating. Their economy was in very bad shape. They needed cash dollars. They needed the black market to operate, although they couldn't overtly facilitate it and condone it. But they did enable these criminal organizations. Some of them were more traditional criminal organizations called thieves-in-law, which did have a hierarchy. But that changed over the years. And these thieves-in-law organizations, many were spawned in prison. They were adept at navigating around government institutions, fleecing government programs, identifying vulnerabilities in government programs, getting around what was but a totalitarian environment. In 1989, the wall comes down, and these criminal organizations which are very sophisticated, very, very well versed in tradecraft, spread west throughout Europe and eventually into the U.S. The next slide here shows, again, it's a little bit of a history lesson, but it shows the first foothold of the Russian organizations in the U.S. in Brighton Beach. And to this day, Brighton Beach is still probably one of the biggest strongholds of the Russian criminal organizations in the United States, although, of course, they've spread out throughout the U.S. They began to show up in places like Miami, Dallas, California. But this young gentleman here, Mr. Ivankov, was a top thief-in-law who was actually sent to the United States to establish a foothold in the U.S. And his schemes were generally around fuel tax fraud, fuel fraud, and that sort of thing. But the point being that the emphasis was on financial crimes. They had other criminal schemes going on, but what they brought with them was tremendous knowledge about financial crimes and how to gain criminal proceeds, profits, without having to expose themselves to long prison sentences and criminal liability. I mean, not to say that they weren't going to go to jail if they got caught, but white-collar crime, especially back then, tended to be fairly not very long sentences. The laws had not caught up with this type of crime, and they really took advantage of a vulnerability in our system. Yaponchik here was sort of a innovator in this area in fraud. He came in 1992. He established himself and his organization, and in fact, there's an anecdotal story about how John Gotti wanted to actually hire him because of his knowledge in the white-collar crime, financial crimes area. Very sophisticated criminal organizations. His was one of the first, but many were to follow. And here's another illustration of this relationship between the intelligence services and organized crime or criminal enterprises. This is Simeon Mogilevich, probably one of the most notorious top 10 fugitives. He's been described as one of the most dangerous criminals that's ever come to the United States. He's an international criminal. He's actually hiding in plain sight in Russia. There's an outstanding international fugitive warrant for him. I would venture to say the Bureau knows exactly where he is, but they can't put their hands on him because he is being protected. So it's another illustration of this type of criminal organization, almost enabled in some ways by the intelligence services and the government. At least it had its origins in that sense. This study that I'm showing you here is an illustration of what we're talking about here. This is a study back in 2000. I couldn't find a more recent one. It was an FBI crime survey that showed the emphasis on the Russian criminal organizations in the financial crime area. You can see that even back then, what we were picking up was there was a huge focus on fraud and financial crimes and money laundering, the two biggest categories that you see on the screen there. So they're different from traditional organized criminal organizations such as the LCN, the drug cartels, other criminal gangs, for example, other criminal organizations, because of their focus, and which again is on the financial crimes, fraud, white-collar crime area. So these are the new mafia, as Brendan has described it, and it's very accurate. Crime as a business, running crime as a business. It's viral because it's all happening, much of it is happening on the Internet. Much of the knowledge is being spread on the Internet. It's global in nature, so it really defies any single law enforcement jurisdiction. They transcend those law enforcement jurisdictions. You remember the old movies where you see the bank robbers crossing state lines and law enforcement stopping at the state. Bonnie and Clyde et al. And this is sort of the international version of that. This is, although there certainly are laws in place that enable some international enforcement actions, and those do happen, it presents huge challenges to law enforcement. And in this particular crime model, institutions and governments are the prime targets. They're going where the money is. Government benefit programs, institutions, financial institutions, insurance companies, going where the big money is, and it is in fact a huge industry. Fraud is an industry. Their numbers are not decreasing; they're increasing. Why is that? Because of those jurisdictional issues. Because we're not really culling the herd, if you will. In many crime problems, and the La Cosa Nostra is a good example. You can actually impact the number of bad guys out there through arrests, through other enforcement actions, through industry actions, etc. But in this particular crime model, their numbers are not decreasing at all. More and more people can just simply go on the Internet and learn how to buy themselves a botnet, buy themselves a mule network, buy themselves a business franchise, a crime business franchise, if you will. There is minimal risk of prosecution, and I'm certainly not. I'm very proud of my law enforcement heritage, and we had, we were doing good things, and still are. It is good to had a training agent tell me, good things happen when you arrest people, which is true. A lot of good things can happen. You can deter future crime. You can get cooperators. You take people off the street. You can reduce losses. But with minimal risk of prosecution, these guys get to operate with impunity. And they're much more networked, which makes it doubly hard for law enforcement to deal with. And I would submit to you that those of you that are in industry, in the banking industry, insurance industry, you're really much closer to the action than law enforcement. Law enforcement is fairly far downstream in their ability to actually impact the losses. You see the transactions, you see when they're registering for benefits, signing up for accounts as transactions move through the system. So there's a good opportunity where at the point of transaction, at the point of account enrollment, where you can actually see the crime setting up. And here's the director of the FBI acknowledging that the playing field has indeed changed. We've seen the shift from regional families with a clear structure to a flat, fluid network with global reach. And that's really the point here. They're more anonymous and more sophisticated, and they're just simply a huge problem from a law enforcement perspective. And I have enough ego to quote myself here. I apologize for that. But to be effective and compliant, we have to keep astride of these changing global landscapes, of these new adversaries and their threats. We have to be constantly assessing their strategies and their capabilities. We can't sit still. And if we continue to adhere to what Brendan referred to earlier as the whack-a-mole strategy, the detection without more context around the detection, we're going to be at the very least inefficient. I love this quote that I'm throwing up here because it's from a movie that I really enjoy, The Wind and the Lion. And in this case, the U.S. government was the wind, and the bad guys, the Barbary pirates, were the lion. And the lion had boundaries. They could not transcend their own boundaries, whereas the United States government could project itself anywhere in the world. And I think the point here is that has changed. It's the bad guys that are projecting themselves around the world, and it's the good guys that have the boundaries. And it makes for a mismatch when it comes to actually impacting the losses that are inflicted by these criminal enterprises. They have no boundaries. They can go anywhere they want, anytime they want. And really, law enforcement and those of you in the AML and fraud professions are almost forced into a reactive posture. It's a low-risk, high-reward profession. So they're risk managers in their own right. They've done the calculus. They've done the equation. They understand perfectly. Even if they do get caught, even to this day, the sentences are not going to be great. And that's if you can put your hands on them. And I will talk a little bit here with 13 minutes left. I hope I get to the part about money mules, because I think Brendan brought this up earlier. I think it's a very, very critical point. That's the Achilles heel, I think, of these enterprises, is that people actually show up and have to do things that are more bricks and mortar oriented. So fraud and organized crime intersect. I mean, it's really fraud and criminal enterprises intersecting. They are inseparable. And I would add to that money laundering as well. These are professionals. They do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This is all they do. And my concern is that we're still geared somewhat towards the opportunistic individual actor, as opposed to the more sophisticated enterprise actor, the ones that are constantly probing thresholds and vulnerabilities, constantly grooming and placing insiders. They work across channels and products. They hit it at every level. They don't allow themselves to operate in these neat little categories, these neat little pigeonholes that we like to place them in. They transcend financial institution fraud across to government benefit frauds, insurance frauds, anywhere where there's money to be made and profits to be made. So we need to enhance our focus on the networking fraud data. We'll talk about that in a minute. The detection with context, link analysis being one of them, social network analysis. So as these criminals spread across the United States, they really invented staged accidents and PIP fraud, personal injury insurance fraud. These were sort of the early financial crimes fraud schemes that they brought to the table. What's different is, you'd say, why is that so unique? Well, staged accidents are probably the single largest fraud category in the insurance industry. And it's a very innovative crime. It combines medical treatment. It combines the bricks and mortar act of staging an accident. It combines filing claims, establishing beneficiaries of the medical benefits and the insurance proceeds, etc. So it's a very sophisticated crime scheme, and virtually innovated by the Russian organized crime groups and the Eastern European groups. This is just a good example of that. Compare the 400 million in claims to what I call the more pedestrian crimes that we see with other more traditional criminal organizations. I mean, these are this is group action. These are people acting in concert. In this case, 8 people, but I'm sure there were more. Actually, there were 43 in Project Sideswipe, but 8 Floridians were part of that. I worked in Miami for 8 years, and I've always said hunting. It's like hunting in the zoo down there. But these are very long-running, sophisticated fraud schemes. These go on for years before they're actually it's not that they're not detected, but they're detected in nodes, one at a time, as opposed to looking across the broader context of the criminal organization or the criminal enterprise. It's healthcare fraud was the next sort of iteration of this financial crime wave. And healthcare fraud is probably the single largest fraud category there is. I mean, bar none, Medicare, Medicaid fraud, private insurance, healthcare fraud, it's anywhere from an $80 billion up to a $200 billion industry. And much of this is organized criminal activity, or at least networked criminal enterprise activity. Again, here's another official acknowledgement of that, where we have the Deputy Secretary of HHS acknowledging that most of the most significant losses to Medicaid and Medicare are coming from these organized crime enterprises, if you will. So you see all this lexicon creeping into the official statements of the law enforcement organizations that are charged with ferreting this out. But I will go back to my original theme that you're in a much better position. Those that are delivering the services are in a much better position to see this first and actually have some impact on loss reduction. Alex Acosta is a U.S. attorney that I know, former U.S. attorney, came out of the Maine Department of Justice, noted what a significant role the bank SARS played in healthcare fraud cases in Miami, which is ground zero for healthcare fraud in the U.S., bar none. Brighton Beach is a distant second, although a very active area, but the South Florida area is by far the most active area when it comes to healthcare fraud. And I dwell in this area because I think it's a very, very critical area for fraud and for your detection activities. Because if you're detecting in context, you're going to see the broader criminal activity going on, and it's not going to. If you're running some of the more sophisticated tools now, you're going to see that this activity is actually linked. I'm going to move very quickly because we have 7 minutes left here, but this is just an illustration. Brighton Beach doctor, Russian, 85 procedures in 20 months on one patient. These schemes go on and on and on. And it is a difficult area to deal with because of the length of time that these fraud schemes go on and on. I'm just going to move through this very quickly, but in 2010, the federal government Department of Justice announced a very broad takedown, 73 defendants. It was an Armenian criminal enterprise. The ringleader was a thief in law. 163 million. This was couched as one of the largest Medicaid takedowns in the history of Medicaid and Medicare. Again, in February 2011, this is a $200 million takedown, 20 individuals, very broad criminal organization, again characterized as one of the largest Medicare, Medicaid frauds in the history of Medicare and Medicaid. You sort of get the picture here. September 2011, 91 defendants, $295 million. This was an 8-year scheme. If you look at the indictments here, you see that these schemes go on for years and years and years. Again, an illustration that the fraud is being detected, but it's not being detected in context. We're detecting nodes and little pieces of the fraud. We're not seeing the broader criminal activity taking place, or it wouldn't be an 8-year scheme. It would be a 6-month, 1-year scheme, and then you'd be able to take it, at least neutralize this organization if we could see it in a broader context. Again, 2012, same thing, $430 million fraud, 91 individuals in that case. So what this says is law enforcement certainly has a role to play here, but it's not a solution. This is over $1 billion in fraud in just 4 takedowns. It illustrates that these schemes can go on for long periods of time and inflict huge losses without the broader organization being detected. So certainly it's a law enforcement triumph when you see these takedowns, but it's not a solution. Law enforcement is not the solution. Just simply too far from the action. So you go from staged accidents to healthcare fraud to now the escalating internet fraud. And this is the most insidious and most profitable crime model. They've evolved, criminal enterprises have evolved into this crime as a service model that Brendan was talking about earlier. Very interesting study that I was involved in North Carolina, where with the sponsorship of Homeland Security, we looked at about 15 businesses across North Carolina, cross-section of industry. Make a long story short, we were assessing their cybersecurity posture. What we discovered that was every one of these businesses had been infiltrated, compromised, their systems been compromised by the RBN, which was started as a legitimate enterprise back in 2006, internet service provider, and then morphed into a criminal organization that is unrivaled, at least in the category of internet-based crime. Very sophisticated. What our findings you can read here. I won't go through this because of the time factor, but it's really an illustration of where we are. When you can go take any cross-section of businesses and note that 100% of these businesses are compromised by a Russian criminal organization, then you're saying something. I think that supports the notion that this is the most dominant crime problem of this millennium. Even more insidious is the business account takeover. Most of these, again, are Eastern European Russian organizations, loosely organized, networked, getting together in the carding sites on the internet. The bad part about this is business account takeover. Most of the time, the business will get stuck with the loss. This is a fairly well publicized compromise in South Carolina, where the the Department of Revenue was compromised again by a Russian business, a Russian criminal organization, picking up 3.5 million tax returns, individual tax returns, and 676,000 individual tax records. So I'm going to skip ahead here. This is Operation Trident breach, which is the largest ID scam, or at least touted as the largest ID scam in U.S. history, 111 arrests. The point being here that this involved mostly money mules. The people who were arrested were the money mules. And again, I'll go back to the original premise here, or what I mentioned earlier, that money mules are the key for a very robust detection program. They are the ones that will actually show up, open an account, and show up in a physical form in that bricks and mortar format. And these are the ones that law enforcement are going after. But I think you're in a very good position to detect these people using the proper tools. I'm going to skip a couple slides ahead here. You can look at these and get to the punchline, if you will. Here's just a quote from a very credible source in law enforcement, the U.S. Attorney in North Carolina, who indicted a bank in North Carolina. And it's basically saying the banks need to understand and need to keep in mind that it isn't just about drugs and terrorist financing. There's much more going on here. The money laundering laws, there are over 230 specified unlawful activities that we're dealing with, over 230 violations to work with, which illustrates that you really can't have money laundering without some sort of underlying specified unlawful activity. And that's the activity that can be detected. Skipping ahead to the significance. I apologize, I'm having to rush through here. Here's the bottom line. Criminal networks engage in serial criminal actions. It's important to make the links. It's important to use the most advanced technology and make that detection in context. Our thresholds get in the way of efficient detection. We need to see the broader picture. Defensive SAR filing is a bit risky because if FinCEN, with its new capabilities, detects a criminal organization before your institution does, that's the risky part of it. You want to be the first one to detect this activity, not the government. Quality detections over quantity of detections. Detection of group activity leads to fewer false positives. It's unambiguous when a group of people are doing something illegal all at the same time. Detection of singular activity lends itself to false positives. But when you get many accounts and many individuals doing the same thing at the same time, I think you eliminate the risk of false positives. These are the conclusions. These are organized systemic activities. You'll reveal money laundering and terror financing when you cast a wide and broad net looking at the criminal enterprise activities. I still think the distinction between fraud and money laundering is a false one. We continue to see organizations that have two separate tracks. One is fraud and one is anti-money laundering. We need to detect in context and detect the group activities. We're looking for quality detections. And as Brendan pointed out earlier, FinCEN's modernization, the electronic filing, their new sophisticated analytical tools, I think is going to raise the bar for AML professionals. Effective use of real-time detection is critical, and proactive strategies will become the norm. So with that, I apologize for having to rush through the presentation, but as I said earlier, I had much more slides and material we can go over, but this will be available for you, and certainly I'll be available for questions. I think my email will pop up here in just a minute when Todd Beck gets back on. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to some questions.
Well, great. And I'm going to jump forward to your email. Oh, sorry, it's right there. There it is. Leave that on the screen for just a second. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Brendan. If you have additional questions for today's experts or you have suggestions for future web seminars, please send those to the address you see on the screen. It's training@acams.org.